A&Pers. This is Dr. Jones checking in. This is A&P1, Lab 4, video 7 maybe. And we're going to talk about the spinal cord. So this is, of course, the spinal cord model. And an important thing to note on the spinal cord is which way is up and which way is down. Which way is anterior, which way is posterior, because some of the pictures in your book show posterior up, and some of the pictures in your book show posterior down. So the first question we need to ask is which way is anterior and which way is posterior. Well, if you've got the vertebra surrounding it, then it's pretty easy to tell. The vertebral body is, of course, anterior. The spinous process is posterior. These are the bumps you can feel down your back of your neck, down the middle of your back. And of course, the transverse processes here will be lateral. So this is going to tell anterior from posterior, starting with, that's kind of small, so let me point with a stick. This is the central canal. And anything anterior to the central canal is anterior in the spinal cord. Anything posterior to the central canal is posterior. Of course, down the middle is medial, and anything off to the sides is going to be called lateral. So the first thing we need to know is the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus. So if you don't have the vertebrae around the spinal cord to tell you anterior from posterior, the fissure versus the sulcus is a great way to do it, because the anterior median fissure is a bigger gap than the posterior median sulcus. So that's why this is a fissure and this is sulcus, because this is a bigger gap. And of course it's in the front, so it's anterior. So anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus. So the white matter are columns, and they don't look like columns when they're cut. They look like just like white splotches, but these are actually myelinated axons traveling up and down the length of the spine. The ascending tracts will carry sensory information up, and the descending tracts will carry motor commands down. So these white parts are called white columns. White matter is always going to be myelinated axons, and again, sensory nerves carry information up to the brain, and motor nerves carry motor commands down from the brain. So these in the front will be your anterior white columns. On the sides we have lateral white columns, and in the back, of course, are the posterior white columns. Now the butterfly here is made of gray matter. Gray matter is unmyelinated axons, dendrites, and somas. So the gray matter, the white matter is in columns, but the gray matter is in horns. And these posterior gray horns do look like horns. They kind of stick out, kind of point. So the anterior gray horns are, of course, in the front, lateral gray horns on the sides, and the posterior gray horns in the back. The central canal we covered. It's the little hole in the center, and it is in fact lined with ependymal cells, and it is filled with fluid. What fluid? Cerebral spinal fluid. So there's no anterior white commissure here. Commissure is when the axons cross midline to go to the other side. If there were an anterior white commissure, it'd be right here. The anterior gray commissure, zoom in a little more, there we go. The anterior gray commissure are these gray unmyelinated axons going left to right and right to left, anterior to the central canal. And the posterior gray commissure are the unmyelinated axons traveling left to right or right to left, crossing the midline, posterior to the central canal. And again, this model does not have an anterior white commissure. If it did, it'd be right here. We do have slides with anterior white commissures. So that's more of a slide term. So the other thing you need to know is that the posterior gray horn processes sensory information. Posterior gray horn processes sensory information, and that'll be both somatic sensory and visceral sensory. The anterior gray horn has motor neurons. This is part of your SNS, your somatic motor system, somatic nervous system, and this part controls your skeletal muscles. The lateral gray horn is part of the ANS. So this is the autonomic nervous system, part of it, and so this will be your visceral motor. Okay, I'm going to zoom back out. Oops, that was in. Out we go. There we go. That should show enough of it. Okay, so now we need to talk about the spinal nerve. On this side, you can see the spinal nerve from here to here. On this side, it's dissected out so that you can see the components inside the spinal nerve, but here where it's covered, right from here to here, before it splits, this part we can still call spinal nerve. This part, since we can see the little bits that are inside it, we will name those more specifically. Okay. So the dorsal root, let me tip this up for you a little bit. So this yellow going in, and you see how it splits down to all those wires? This is all the dorsal root. The dorsal, and dorsal means posterior, and this is posterior, it's behind the central canal where it goes in. And so these are all the sensory information going into the spinal cord. The dorsal root, all the sensory information going into the spinal cord. And this lump right here is the dorsal root ganglion. And the ganglion is always going to be a bunch of neuron somas or cell bodies that are peripheral to the nervous, in the peripheral nervous system. So not in the central nervous system, not in the spinal cord itself. So these are going to be your sensory neuron somas in the dorsal root ganglion. Every now and then I ask my students, what's a ganglion? And they say, that's a gang of lions. Like that's not, okay, whatever. But as long as we can spell it, we're good. The ventral root is going to carry motor commands out of the spine. So let me tip this up. You see all of these wires and where they come together are all called the ventral root. And it does come out anterior. Ventral means anterior. So all of the sensory commands that go into your spine go in the dorsal root and are processed in the posterior gray horn, which processes sensory information. And then all the motor commands to move your muscles come from the anterior gray horn, which is part of your SNS, and send those motor commands out the ventral root. So remember in muscles we talked about motor neurons. Here's where the somas of the motor neurons are. And then these ventral roots are the axons that control your motor units, the spinal, the skeletal muscles. So let's say that a mosquito bites your arm. That information, sensory information, goes up the dorsal root to the posterior gray horn. Say you decide to smack the mosquito or you can just smush it. The motor command will come from here. Well, it doesn't start here, but it goes through here, through these axons of the motor neurons in the anterior gray horn, out the ventral root. These are the motor neurons that go to control your skeletal muscles. So you squish your arm, squish the mosquito. So that's how that works. Okay, should we do this whole list on one video? Should we keep going? Okay, so we'll do the spaces next. The epidural space is outside the dura here. It's this connective tissue, which is a lot of adipose CT and blood vessels. So when they give an epidural with a needle, this is where they're aiming for the epidural space. And then the dura mater, let me tip this up. This right here is the dura mater. And then the subdural space is a potential space. You see that dark line there, just big enough for my fingernail? That's the subdural space. It's not an actual space, it's a potential space. And then just under that, right here, that blue line underneath it, that blue kind of wall right there, that is the arachnoid mater. So let me zoom out for you. Okay, so the duramater and the arachnoid mater are touching, but there's a potential space between them, just like there's a potential space between my hands right now. There's not a space between my hands, but there's a potential space between my hands because my hands are separate structures and I can separate them, okay? So this wall right here is the two membranes together, the duramater and the arachnoid mater with a potential space between them. Okay, so the potential space. So we've got epidural space where you're aiming when you give an epidural, and then the duramater, the subdural space, and then the arachnoid mater. And this big space in here is the subarachnoid space that, like the central canal, is filled with CSF. And then the pia mater, zooming back in, the pia mater lines the spinal cord and goes up into the anterior median fissure, but does not go into the posterior median sulcus. We also need to know about the denticulate ligament. Zooming in, and I grab the stick. You see that 15 in there? Let's use a pointy end of the stick. So that 15 there is the denticulate ligament. It's a little lump, and that ends up being actual pia mater that goes out to connect to the duramater, and that keeps the spinal cord centered in the spinal canal so that when you flex to one side or the other, you're not overstretching the nerves to one side or the other. It keeps the spinal cord centered in its space. Okay, well, we're past 10 minutes, so I'm going to shut this video down, and we have one more video to do, and then we're done with this set of notes. So this has been A&P 1 Lab 4 video, I think 7. The education must go on. Dr. J out.